just a moment. We'll let some folks come in. Welcome for those joining. Okay, why don't we get started? So Nick, Rose, and Maura, welcome to this event. Virtual, of course, we're still very much virtual. So for those who don't know me, my name is Vera Zakam. I am a senior advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology. In California on the West Coast. We exist really to outpace emerging security challenges by really connecting both policymakers and technologists on a whole number of slew of challenges from technology and democracy, nuclear security, cognitive security, and so on, and cybersecurity, of course, and so on and so forth. But so what I thought we would do, if it's afternoon your time, if you're on the East Coast, I think it's evening if you're in Europe, or maybe morning if you're in the Pacific, and morning here in California, is to take this opportunity. I've invited some of my colleagues and friends, and all the three individuals on the screen I really do consider friends too, to really talk a little bit about the Summit for Democracy that just took place. It was a pretty incredible summit with a lot of commitments, a lot of engagement on a whole slew of topics, and how we revitalize democracy, not just here at home, but globally around the world. And what we're going to be doing today is having a conversation about how do we actually take the commitments that were made during the summit last week, and what does this actually mean to act on them in this year of consultation, in this year of action, before the next summit will take place in a year. So before I go into the commitments and we'll have a conversation, of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end, I do want to introduce these amazing three individuals that we have with us today. So first, Rose Jackson is an entrepreneur, and she's a director of the Tech and Democracy Program at the Atlantic Council at the DFR Lab. She is an entrepreneur and former diplomat with extensive experience strengthening democracy and defending human rights all over the world. I think Rose has traveled all over the world in doing that, leveraging tech for social impact and building institutions to support democratic activists around the world as well. Prior to her current role, she was the founder and CEO of Beacon, a platform for leveraging data and marketing technology to make it easier for people to make meaningful civic and political action. Among her many incredible accomplishments, she served in the Obama administration as the chief of staff to the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department, and was an advisor to Senator Chris Coons prior to that. Maura Whalen leads the National Democratic Institute Tech program, with literally teams all over the world implementing really on the ground tech related solutions and ensuring that technology serves democracy, literally, not literally all over the world, I should say. Laura is a friendly face probably to many as well. At NDI, of course, her program, she will tell us more about this, but really it's everything from countering digital authoritarianism, information manipulation, and disinformation, but it's also making sure democracy work for the people, and also including women and girls and other marginalized communities. Maura, one of the things, of course, she's served extensively in both USAID and the State Department, in the Obama administration as well, on some of these issues as well. And last, but certainly not least, I do want to welcome Nick Pickles. He is a senior director for the Global Public Policy Strategy Development and Partnership at Twitter, really leading the company's thinking and strategic work on a lot of the critical issues at the intersection of tech, public policy, politics, and democracy. I've had the pleasure of working with Nick, obviously when I was at Twitter as well. And I'm sure you've seen him also, as he's done a lot of testimonies all over the world. One of the interesting thing about Nick is that he's the current chair of the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism's board, and is also on the sitting on the boards for the BBC Media Action and the Technology Coalition. So I wanted to bring these individuals together because I do think it's really, really important as we develop these solutions and think about the year of action, to really think about this cross-sectoral collaboration and coordination and what that really looks like and where do we need to act. So before I go with questions, just for our, I guess, listeners, just the key things to remind folks of what was actually proposed. Across from the White House of the major sort of democratic renewal, there was actually two things, one sort of global and one that's actually focused on American, on the United States and what we need to do here in the United States as well. So the key things, just really short introduction. One was advancing an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, and a commitment to doing that, that we need to make sure that we have an internet that is reliable, secure, and affirms our commitment to protecting and respecting human rights online and across the digital ecosystem. Funding digital democracy programs. USAID has committed 20.3 million to programming to make that happen. Combating digital authoritarianism, and that is everything to not just promoting internet freedom, but ensure that we don't suppress people and marginalized communities with technologies not within the countries, but also export those technologies for oppressive means and make sure that we're adhering to human rights standards as well. And then also ensuring that we're advancing democracy and affirming technologies. How do we actually create emerging technologies that actually serve public interest and that serve democracies? And there has been a fund that has been supported to make that happen as well. And the last but not least, I will just mention, under the White House has put out under the Strengthening American Democracy Initiative to include countering disinformation and misinformation. And one of the things that was proposed is this Information Integrity Research and Development Working Group, strengthening digital literacy and increasing access to broadband, among other initiatives. So lots of things have been proposed. I know it's a lot, and there was a number of commitments from over 100 countries participated. So I'm going to first, before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty issues, kind of go around our virtual room, start with Rose, Maura, and then Nick. I want to get your first quick reactions. So on tech and democracy specifically, what did you hear that you liked, and where do you feel that there are gaps? And when I say gaps, holistically, not specifically, I mean, of course, give examples on any one of these issues or other things, but where do you see there is this real opportunity to hone in on in the year ahead? Rose, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Farah, and thanks for convening all of us. It's pretty easy to have a crazy summit like what happened last week and then shut down for the year, and everyone shows up in January trying to remember what happened. So it's a very useful conversation. To dive right into your question, I think in terms of things that I liked, I was pleasantly surprised to see the announcement of a coalition working on addressing surveillance tech and the export of surveillance tech, particularly from democratic countries to authoritarian regimes. I think that's hugely important, and something that the United States was poised domestically to start taking leadership on with the announcement of some updated pieces of the Wassenaar protocol and the listing of NSO and others in the month leading up. So that's excellent. I think overarching, and I'm seeing that I'm showing up in two places today. It's the magic of technology. I think overarching, though, I would say that the administration, I don't want to put this just on the administration, I think the world's democracies writ large are really struggling to figure out how to address this big, giant issue that is tech in society. I think got to the point of, in different places, saying it matters, it's important, not quite sure exactly what we should do. And I do think that the administration missed a big opportunity in placing it, at the center of the agenda. So if we had countering authoritarianism, we had advancing human rights, and then we had countering corruption, which, in some ways was a little confusing in that you had a very specific topical thing mixed with these big giant categories, and it may just be that I'm the director of something called the Democracy and Tech Initiative, but I think technology deserves to be one of the center questions, because I do think it is core to the survival of democracy and a rights-based world order, whether or not we figure out how to govern technology in a rights respecting way, and whether democracies are able to come together to drive that forward in a global system. And so my hope is for a year of action, as countries kind of come to that central importance, that we'll see a focus on it, which would enable, as you referenced, Vera, some of the kind of action in the domestic side and conversation in the international side to potentially come together in more productive ways, but also for us to put the real resources and energy and effort over the course of the next year, whether that's from industry, from different governments or civil society, towards really figuring out what does it look like to show up at summit number 2, the big in-person one, with some real deal progress, real commitments, driving things forward at a moment that I would say is pretty existential globally, in determining, again, whether we have a digital world that is viable in a rights context. So I'll pause there and obviously talk more about that over time, but it's a good start and there's huge opportunity in front of us. So to suggest that is a missed opportunity that certainly can be remedied.
And as you rightly point out, technology kind of runs through everything across the board of everything that we do and see and feel these days. So I think that's also spot on. Maura, over to you. Just kind of key takeaways. Just first, and I want to say overly flowery, but like your hope for the next year ahead, but also where there's opportunities. But
my likes and dislikes.
Yeah.
Thanks again. Also, Vera, it's good to see both Rose and Nick and you, and thanks for gathering us. So mine is a lot the same of Rose. I think what I saw that was really hopeful were a few things. One, the willingness of democracies to sort of come together and address these issues. That in and of itself can be a game changer. And I think although we heard new things, what we need to focus on is also the commitment to that which we already have, right? Working within the systems and showing up in a robust way. And I think that's going to be a really important part of the next year when we see conferences transform into actual accountability mechanisms. And that's what I really hope to see going forward. Also, a few other things. I did see a commitment to infrastructure again, like the actual towers and wires and mechanisms that will help, particularly the global South and the developing world, to address the authoritarian tech problem that they have. And that's new for the US government, or I should say what's old is new again, and going back to providing the actual hardware for countries to make a different choice and working together. And that's been a continuation we saw it in the Quad, we saw it in other places along the way. On the disinformation side, well, those two, I think, also address the other big thing that happened last week, which was, Maria Ressa giving her outstanding remarks, accepting the Nobel Prize, where she really did urge us to look upstream. And that is something we saw the summit do a lot of, is instead of looking at content moderation as the main part of this conversation, we looked upstream and we looked at open internet issues, and we looked at reinforcing the Freedom Online Coalition and the GNI, and those organizations got name checked by the White House, which I think is really, really important. But going to disinformation, the other big one that was big for NDI and we've identified as a game changer for the coming year is this idea of making social media platforms a place where women feel safe. Politically engaged women in particular. That is really central to democracy. And we saw the White House announce a task force, that they're a multilateral task force to address the issue. Obviously, addressing violence online against women is not sufficient to fixing democracy, but it will go a long way as helping us, because that's the public forum, right? That's where women have to, and if women don't feel safe online expressing their political opinion, they don't run for office, they don't get elected, and that's bad for democracy. So that's one area where we really hope to see actual progress in the online space as well. I'll stop there. I know we have tons to cover, but I feel like that's a good segue over to Nick.
Yeah, for sure. And Nick, yeah, and of course, I'm sure you'll have some comments from what Maura said. And I would love to also give you the floor. Obviously, you represent Twitter, but like also just kind of perspectives, also broader, if you will, in the broader digital platform space and private sector, where there's also an opportunity to engage, or where you hope to engage in this kind of year of action consultation.
Sure, and thank you, and hopefully during the next year we can all be together and have these conversations in person again. So I know there's always more to discuss than we have time for on these events. I think just to build on what Maura was saying, I think one of the biggest things for me, I've been at Twitter coming on 7.5 years now. Tech is often sort of talked about in isolation, and so I think seeing the way the summit framed technology alongside independent media, alongside corruption, alongside infrastructure, all of those threads being pulled together in one place, I think is pretty new, and is definitely a welcome step forward. I think the second piece, which is I think very stark from the conversation, is we can't take the open internet for granted. I think there is a degree of assumption that actually when we're looking at the threats to the open internet, we're looking at the policy developments globally, that the internet is kind of something we don't actually have to worry about. It'll always be there. And I think the summit is a recognition that actually the open internet globally is under threat more than ever before from a number of different directions, many of them coming from states. I think in terms of looking ahead, I think one of the biggest areas of challenge is that often this is framed as a question of, we have democratic states and you have authoritarian states, and that there's actually a huge number of states who in different policy areas are sort of adopting policies from a range of different motivations. And you're actually getting this kind of middle group of states who in some areas on human rights or free expression or the open internet more broadly are adopting policies that don't mean that a democracy becomes authoritarian, but do pose a risk to the open internet. And so I think how you manage that discussion about that middle group of countries is actually really, really hard. And again, just building on what Rosa and Maura said, I think looking to the next year and the year of action, I think the work that's happened in the Freedom Online Coalition, that was celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, the work happening at the IGF, there's an array of different forums globally all talking about these related issues. And I think one of the things that I think is going to be really important to the success of the year of action is bringing all those stakeholders together, making sure that the private sector is part of the conversation, because the private sector is far bigger than just the 3 or 4 companies you often see testifying before Congress, and also civil society, and having a really robust civil society presence, so that we make sure that as we start to move from discussion into action, that the policies being adopted have the greatest action where it's most needed. And sometimes I think it's civil society have the best perspective on where help and action is most urgently needed. And so I think, again, Maria Reza working on the Global Fund for Independent Media is a great example of how really she's become a leader in identifying opportunities. And I hope that we're able to bring perspectives like that into planning for the year of action. No,
that's great. And you kind of, if you will, stole my next line, and that is because I actually wanted to follow up on the open internet. Sort of, that's obviously, we've just talked about how that's absolutely critical to functioning democracies. And so, and I know you also, Twitter has put out sort of their sort of policy proposals for how to make that and make sure that open internet is marries with democratic values and democratic norms. Let me just ask you a follow-up question, and I'll turn to Rose with a slightly different angle. But from perspective for bringing civil society and for actually private sectors to the table, like what does this actually mean in the year of action? Is it, you just mentioned, okay, making sure that it's not just the 4 companies that typically testify. Are we talking about that more of emerging technologies and sort of other kind of mission-driven tech companies or aspiring tech companies that serve the public interest should be part of the table, that are also, for example, creating broadband, right? And creating that open, like really working for open internet infrastructure, particularly in places around the world where it's badly needed to really counter some of this digital, quite frankly, digital authoritarianism kind of regimes like China and Russia as examples, right? We're talking about in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world. So I'm curious, like, it's part of, like, we have the Freedom Online Coalition, and then we have strong participation from civil society. But so what, like, like, what specifically from the private sector do we need to do on the open internet?
And I think, you touched on some of the issues there. I think one of the things that's always important to remember is the fact that, if you can't access the internet because of a lack of infrastructure, because it's too expensive, because the way that data is structured, whether there's an open internet or there's a walled garden of just a few services that are provided through deals with telcos, that is a basic building block of, if you can't access the open internet, then all of the other conversations we're having are far less pressing for you. And so I think, at a really foundational level, it's questions like access. And then when you're having questions about access, you have conversations about infrastructure. And when we're having conversations about infrastructure, we have conversations about things like net neutrality and what kind of policies protect and make sure infrastructure is secure and trusted. And then, building on the infrastructure, you can then talk about the content layer. And we can talk about access to services. We can talk about, as Moira was saying, safety and issues, including parts of the world where social media has become, because of an absence of free media or an absence of civic space, social media has become that vital civic space to for journalists, for citizens, for political activists to come together and talk about change. And so I think that's why you need that full landscape of every part of industry, but it starts with access. And if you can't access the internet, then I think that's why, involving USAID and those kind of policymakers, civil society being at the table, make sure you don't forget the issues that are happening across the world. And sometimes, we focus on the issue that's most pressing in DC or the issue that's most pressing in Brussels. Making sure we have civil society at the table, make sure we have an honest global conversation.
Absolutely. No, and spot on. Rose, over to you, and you may have some thoughts on this as well. So recently there's been conversations, and Politico also reported on this, number of proposals on how do you actually create the infrastructure from like the government side, and then include partners and allies to create that open internet, and how do you strengthen that to ensure that we are adhering to democratic values and human rights. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, on that as part of, things that you may have been kind of following as part of your work at the Atlantic Council. And again, just kind of focusing on, well, where do we go from there in the next year, from both government and civil society, your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, to refer to something that Moira alluded to before, I might say something somewhat controversial, but we have a lot of international institutions and initiatives and coalitions. And I think there's a tendency when we create something like a Summit for Democracy to say, like, what's the new thing we're going to create that'll show we're serious? And I think we've reached a moment where we really have to have conversations about either strengthening the things that we have, or honestly articulating why they don't work if they don't work, rather than just continually adding. And so I think that there's the beginnings of a really important conversation about where are the mechanisms. So we've already alluded to the Freedom Online Coalition, the 10-year anniversary of that. At the same time, the UN's Internet Governance Forum. We have mechanisms like the ITU, where major negotiations take place for determining the literal rules of how the internet itself functions. And there's all of these different places. And so I think what people are hungry for right now, and you're probably alluding to some reports that the White House had been throwing around the idea of an alliance for the future of the internet, is really getting a sense of what is the state of the world. And so as Nick did a great job of articulating kind of what we're really talking about, from the I'm going to use the word, from the pipes up to the content layer, each one of those different levels has people and governments have the ability to influence and put norms within them. And so even the creation of the internet itself, the kind of access points, comes with viewpoint. And so one of the things that we all try to not talk about, but we're actually talking about, is the way in which countries like China and some other authoritarian states are proactively pushing forward this alternative vision for the internet. So if we started with the idea of the free, open, secure, and interoperable internet, which is what all of us here on this call are kind of referencing back to, as Nick alluded to, the assumption that that was just there, that you don't have to do anything to defend it. It's a contested space. And the places it's contested are everywhere from the infrastructure to the kind of to the content and the rules and the regulatory conversations that we're perhaps more accustomed to. And so I think it's definitely time for the world's democracies to have a conversation about what would it take to make sure that those basic norms are not just defended, but advanced. The digital world now is more than just quote unquote the internet. And it's clear, as evidenced by, as Nick was alluding to, even democratic countries genuinely struggling to figure out what the right balance is in their own spaces, right? The regulatory efforts in Australia, in Canada, in the UK, all are taking approaches that I personally am pretty concerned about. The United States is frankly just absent in playing in that space. China has a very clear sense of what it wants, and it benefits from a fractured democratic world. And so I think if the conversations that we're talking about in the context of whether it's, you know, the Alliance for the Future of the Internet or anything else, bringing all of those people to the table that we've all been talking about, the civil society, government, and not just Western governments that are having, you know, either are home to many of the companies we're talking about or have kind of the core power, but countries from the global South that are struggling with issues of access and on and on and on, together with industry, to have this real necessary updated conversation about taking those principles, not questioning those principles, but taking those principles and updating them for the modern era and determining what's missing. What are the mechanisms that we don't have right now that we need to? What are the conversations that we haven't had? What are the agreements? But doing that by building on top of what we have. Because the reality is we do come from a point of strength. And I think there is a bit of a fatalistic approach right now because democracy is under threat and it is backsliding all over the world, that we enter the space saying, well, we have to start everything fresh. Universal Declaration of Human Rights are pretty good. They're an excellent framework that have proven quite durable and universal by definition. And so taking that as the starting point and taking all of those, you know, I made a joke about there being too many coalitions, alliances, and institutions, but they're all built on top of that framework. And that means that it's driving in a similar direction. So taking this moment and building on the really strong history and legacy of a rights-based framework for the internet provides us a real opportunity while authoritarians around the world think that they might have the upper hand. The only way that we're going to be successful, though, is if we do come together and come together now. And so the timing couldn't possibly be better.
I mean, you said it. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's just like, this is like more what you were talking about, almost like we can talk about any one of these single issues, but it's also about the upstream and how do you like kind of like now elevate this and focus this, which I think is going to be super important. Maura, let me follow up with you on the tactical thing, which is a very nice segue from what Rose just talked about on the authoritarianism part of it, the digital authoritarianism part of this. It has been definitely over the last number of years that this is one of the biggest threats really facing democracy and human rights in sort of this digital era, if you will. So on that, how do we actually, practically speaking, the year of action, develop, design, measure impact of initiatives that really get at the digital authoritarianism problem? You know, for example, I know for example, the White House proposed the multilateral search and sustained fund for anti-censorship technology. There's a number of other things. And how do you actually design programs and to really scale them in partnership, not just, you know, if they're from USAID or State Department in partnership with civil society and the private sector in the global South, like in places where it's really, really is particularly needed, not to say it's also an issue here in the United States and other parts of the world, but like, how do you actually move the needle on this?
So I think kind of building on Rose's point, and then sort of going off in a little bit of a different direction. I think it's important to remember that when we talk about alliances or groups or things like that, one, just because democracies get together and decide something does not mean that it is inherently rights-based and democratic, right? Like you have to actively insert a rights conversation into the process. That is what makes it democratic. So you can't build it behind closed doors, show it to people and be like, see, it's democratic. So we should remember here, as Rose was saying, the process and the constant engagement is the objective. The other thing to remember, I think, based on that, is that there should be an objective. And the one that is front and center for all of us right now that Nick sort of alluded to is democracies need to figure out how to work together to raise the cost of shutting down the internet, denying access. There's no cost right before an election for a dictator to shut down the internet. We're seeing it as a first course of action. So what is the cost? And I think that's really, if we can get to that answer this year and we can start creating accountability and putting controls in place that countries will shut off your aid, or they'll, there's even actually a public statement in some cases would be kind of nice coming from Western democracies, would be great. And as Rose was saying, they provided an alternative for the internet. We should also remember Russia and China last week provided an alternative vision of democracy, right? Like they actually wrote it on paper and published it in the midst of the Democracy Summit, which I think is super interesting. But when we talk about what it's going to take, we first need to remember the democratic actors we work with every day who are playing a cat and mouse game with giant, attackers, authoritarians who are seeking to control them, seeking to, and you think about these men and women who are just like so threatening to Vladimir Putin, or it's really speaks to the power of the idea and the power of the mechanisms by which they convene. But we do have to, and we did see that last week, the White House take steps to really strengthen those tools. And we have a lot of that, for instance, in the Open Technology Fund, we're doing remote web hosting and VPNs for everyone and all sorts of cybersecurity protections. That's insufficient. And I think if we want to see a real commitment to public interest tech, and we're starting to see this sort of take place, we have to recognize that they're kind of the governments that we're talking about and the private sector and the philanthropy world have the ability to create an ecosystem that will sustain that conversation. Because if you, well, Rose can speak to this, if you create a startup that is like well-intentioned, after 5 years of exhaustion of getting it to a certain level, there's sort of no, that's when the money dries up. That's when the funding walks away. Everybody wants the new thing, but the sustained funding and then keeping those actors in the game to keep creating more, keep building the next great thing, the incentive structures just aren't there to do it. So they have the ability to create that. And finally, I just say, recognizing that talent does not exist in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. It is global, it is localized. And every other day there's a cool tool that comes across our desk that somebody is building, and we need to support that, and we need to network those folks. We spend a lot of time doing it, but more, please.
Yeah, on that last point, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just the whole idea is, I personally believe that, like sort of the fostering sort of the next generation of tech entrepreneurs and developers all over the world is one of the key ways to actually elevate all of this. Nick, I want to turn to you on digital authoritarianism. I think I'd be also curious, like in this next year, what can especially digital platforms do? Really digital platforms can do on digital authoritarianism, just because, as you had mentioned earlier, people come to Twitter, as an example, to really have access to information and to see what's happening, right? Or whatever it is, especially all political information on elections or whatever it is, right? So when it's actually, when it, for example, internet is shut down, and then when there are, if you will, authoritarian regimes that are using tech for repressive means, like what are some of the practical things that digital platforms can do? And also in partnership with not just US government, but other governments as well, and civil society.
It's a broad subject, so I'll try my best to pull out a few thoughts. I think firstly, and so you mentioned the paper that we published earlier on, and part of the mindset behind publishing that paper was, I think there's often a question of what does good regulation look like, and we felt that actually when you're talking about these kinds of issues, it's really important for democracies and companies to kind of advocate for what good policy looks like. There are absolutely challenges that the internet poses. There are real harms that are caused by what happens on technology. And so there are policy problems to tackle. The challenge is to design policy solutions that protect the open internet and enable policymakers to tackle those issues. And so I think, when we're discussing with policymakers around the world, we're not saying they shouldn't regulate. We're working with them to identify how to solve that public policy problem and protect the open internet. And I think that partnership with civil society to make sure that debate is happening is really important. And we train civil society groups and activists around the world to use Twitter to join those conversations, to drive discussion of public policy issues and technology, because we need that vibrant conversation about how these policies will impact the civic space is incredibly important. So there's capacity building work we can do. We can also work with partners like Lumen. So the Lumen project, some of you may know, is a transparency project designed to enable people to see the legal requests that companies are basing decisions on when we take the decision that on the grounds of content subject to a legal request, we make that content geographically not available in the country that requested it. But Lumen enables you to look at what country has requested what content. That transparency is critical. And I think, looking at the technology agenda, I think one of the things that is an opportunity is to increase the conversation about transparency, focusing on government actions. Generally speaking, most of the conversations that happen around transparency are focused on private sector actors. And actually, and this comes back to kind of the broader point, if you have a number of countries setting the example about transparency, about due process, about the rule of law, that puts pressure on everyone else to raise their standards. And so I think you can set an example that has a positive impact on the conversation. And then finally, I think, it's also important to remember that platforms like Twitter are a tool. And if people have access to a tool, it doesn't mean they can use it. And I think that's where, again, information coming from credible media sources, coming from people who have been trained in how to communicate and are actually engaging with their audience, using the services themselves. And so I'm a big advocate of public diplomacy, and it's not just for civil society to use the platforms. It's a huge opportunity for governments to use them as well, to press these issues and actually to enter into that debate of ideas we're having. As Rose said, this is a contested space, and the ideas that we're seeking to contest and to put forward need to be vocally articulated, and places like Twitter are a great place to have that conversation.
No, that's great. I just also want to remind folks, if folks have questions, please submit them via Q&A as well. Those who are listening to us and join the call. Rose, just wanted to follow up with you specifically on the transparency side of the angle.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad Nick brought that up. And it's one thing that, we'd be remiss if we didn't say that give some credit to the Danish government, which announced kind of in the lead up to the US summit, a summit, I believe it's the Technology for Democracy Summit, which will then have an in-person pair in June, trying to look specifically at tech leading in. And one of the things that they organized is a framework of action coalitions, where they asked civil society, governments, industry to come together, propose things that need to, either important conversations that need to be addressed, actionable work that you can carry forward, something that's ready-made to feed into their June summit, feed into the US summit or beyond. And one of the things that became very clear is, as Nick alluded to, a lot of people are talking right now about transparency in the context of tech, which of course is foundational to democracy, makes a lot of sense when we're talking about kind of how power is flowing in an interconnected and digital world. But one of the things that became very clear is that no one has a shared definition for what we mean by transparency. And one example was just given. It is absolutely important to know what governments are demanding, what pieces of information or action from platforms who are working across numerous different jurisdictions with different laws, some more democratic than others. So that's one form. That means transparency. The thing that most people think about, like, give me information from a platform. I need to know what data Facebook has, which means almost nothing, is another form that people think of. But as the Europeans, for instance, are pushing forward the Digital Services Act, as in the United States, there's actually quite a bit of movement on increasing the ability of American regulators to do a better job of understanding the way in which the digital world is impacting American citizens, on and on and on and on. There's this real opportunity to come together around that as a specific issue in the context of important democratic principles for technology, and better define, what do we mean by transparency? What do we want from it? What kinds of information, for whom and in what forms? And so we're really excited to join with the Global Networks Initiative, to join with the Center for Democracy and Technology, for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and a few other groups as part of one of those Danish coalitions, to start bringing together that conversation, hopefully able to provide a little bit more common language and grounding for all of those different things that I just said, those different conversations that are happening, and be able to hopefully show up at the next summit with some clarity, so that we can be asking for similar things, working on similar things, and have common understanding of the ground. And that may seem extremely nerdy and unexciting to people, but that's the work. And so I think the more that we're able to, frankly, have the hard conversations of identifying for a industry player, for instance, that when Twitter is asked by a government to take action it doesn't want to have to take, or Twitter finds out that a government's doing something using its platform that it doesn't like, how do we ensure that we're able to have a conversation as a community of small d Democrats about how to support Twitter in that moment, or how to support an activist in that moment, or how, as a community of countries, to put pressure on the offending regime at that moment? And I think we don't necessarily have the right mechanisms for that process. So the more that we're able to take the chunks of those problems and start having honest conversations about how we might do that better, I think we'll be in a better place. And so I highlight that just because I know that we're all talking at this extremely high level about these grandiose ideas, or remaking the vision of the internet and the digital world. But at the end of the day, sometimes it does come down to these core questions of, how do we have conversations with the right people at the right time to make sure power is put at the back of the most vulnerable in society?
And that's at the core, right? Like, if we can actually get to that in this upcoming
super
year,
simple. It's very simple.
Super simple, simple dimple. And so, like, if we get to the core, sometimes you almost need to kind of start at the basic. Who are the key, like, who are the critical key stakeholders that you need to have on these issues? And, how do you need to, and what is the desired objective, and how do you need to reach the people that you're trying to reach with it? Like, what's the desired outcome, basically? So I think that was also very much spot on. Maura, I want to turn to you, slightly different question. You've worked, I'm going to kind of go back to your public sector career here. And so you've worked with both in the USAID and State Department, and of all the different, and then now, like, putting on your NDI hat, with all the different things that have been proposed, if you had to there's just so much to do this year, right? With this kind of year of action, and Roche just gave an example of one thing, specific things. But if you had to prioritize, for the U.S. government in terms like actual prioritize the investments that they should do, is it sort of internet freedom and countering digital disinformation? Is it ensuring on disinformation, digital authoritarianism, but is it ensuring that people have credible information and countering disinformation? Is it also, you mentioned at the start of our call, which I think is super important, is protecting women and girls online, and what that also means offline, so we get a greater participation. So many initiatives, so many things you can say, right? And then in theory, we have this year to make something happen with this. So where should, in your view, prioritization be?
I mean, yes, I guess that's That's the answer. No, I mean, but getting into it, I think number one, and we have seen the US government make this shift, at least conceptually, is moving away from putting technology like off on its own in a corner versus integrating it into all of the existing regimes and structures that we have, right? So, you know, we've moved now to where we say that that's what's going to happen. And what we saw right before the summit was the State Department announce a reorg that will better enable it to show up in a lot of these conversations, and not just show up from an economic and national security standpoint, but they also did a really great job of integrating a rights-based consideration into that conversation. So when we're talking about prioritization, number one is show up in all these rooms, all the open-ended working groups, all of the, like, you know, Freedom Online Coalition, all of them. That really has to be priority number one, because, you know, we can see we're talking about this issue this week. We, you know, talked about it last week. That power of convening and the power of leadership is really critical. And I think we're going to see that over the next year, primarily in the United States and Europe. But I think we're also, you know, I would look to a lot of the regional organizations of like the AU and the OAS. The OAS regional meeting is coming up this summer in Washington. The Organization for American States, sorry, for those not steeped in the alphabet stew, we're all in. But I think what we really need to do, what they needed to prioritize, was getting the structures right and making sure you have your diplomatic activity, you're showing up in those rooms, letting USAID do what it's best at, which is implement, work with programs, put the power in the hands of people to define their own futures, define their own systems, and move the ball forward on all these different fronts. At the same time, you know, fueling technologies to circumvent authoritarian actors, all the things. So I know that that's, you know, it's hard to say yes, but what we really lacked is a strategy. And it's not to say we haven't articulated one yet. I don't think we do, but we've actually got players on the field now, and we have an intention to show up in those rooms. And I think that is a big step forward, but, you know, it's a tall order for the next year, most certainly.
No, that's great. Nick and Rose, I'm going to ask kind of the same question to you, but obviously from different angles. So for Nick, you from more private sector and digital platform broadly, not just Twitter. You know, we talk about on this whole tech and democracy, and then you use any one of these issues, you know, we talk about how important sort of the whole of society response to all of this, right? And making sure that governments, plural, private sector, including digital platforms and civil society, are at the table. So my question is, practically speaking, not like high fluff, big idea type stuff, how do we actually strengthen that partnership and collaboration from private sector? Is it that you guys just need to show up in these conversations and working groups and forums that Mauro just mentioned? Is it kind of, you know, be members of coalitions to, for example, on disinformation, so you can preempt, you know, address the threats before they actually address issues before they become threats? Is it kind of exchanging information? Like, what is it that you think from your perspective, practically in the year of action, where do you put your foot forward as part of from private sector for this kind of whole society? And Rose, I'm just going to follow up with the same question for you, but from civil society, where, you know, civil society has been such a critical voice and really advocating, and in some instances pushing back on issues that really need that pushing, if you will, across the tech and democracy. And again, pick whatever issue you want. But how do we make sure that strength, that again, not just showing up, but, you know, forcing the commitments, you know, like any kind of like concrete steps. So when maybe just hopefully, maybe even on a small level, maybe next time we meet in a year, hopefully in person, the president convenes the, you know, some round two, you know, that we say, yeah, we've actually moved the needle on strengthening that private public civic partnership side of it on a lot of these issues. So Nick, I'm going to start to you and then move over to Rose.
Sure, I think there's two things that really spring to mind. I think firstly, I've been involved in in the past sort of few years, some pretty new ways of having multi-stakeholder engagement between industry, civil society, and government. The Christchurch Call, I think, was a very rare and was the first process of its kind that brought together from a very deliberate stage at the beginning, recognizing the societal impact of that horrible attack and bringing the civil society actors, industry, and governments together to tackle a shared problem. And that built trust, but it took time. And I think also with the Danish government's Copenhagen pledge, the challenge often of identifying even which bit of that multi-stakeholder process is best placed to tackle something, and also best placed to lead. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that governments will always be leading these processes. And I think actually it's important to find opportunities and be deliberate where actually civil society or the private sector or academia might be able to bring something else to the process. So I think the key thing for me firstly is being very deliberate about widening participation. And that means from every corner of the globe, it means from every economic and cultural background, the strength of this process will be built in its diversity. And so I think that means investing in proactively seeking the views. As Maura mentioned, the word soup of acronyms and conferences that we all kind of occupy, you could go to many of those forums and hear from the same people because a lot of us travel between those forums. And so actually stepping out of some of those kind of pre-existing processes and asking, where are we not hearing from? Which sectors actually do we need to be really much more deliberate about hearing from? And then how do we bring them into the process going forward? It isn't just a matter of doing a one-off consultation. It's about bringing them in and strengthening all these different processes. And then secondly, I just think it's also really important to have in the back of our minds that the threat landscape isn't static either. And so we're all talking now, I think one of the biggest shifts perhaps in the past year has been the movement of traditionally activities that have been the purview of nation states, offensive cyber capability, scaled disinformation campaigns, are moving to be commercial sectors. And so I think the evolution of an industry around some of these issues to survey people, to propagate misinformation, that becoming a commercial field is a different threat to when it was just governments doing it. And so I think we also need to make sure that we also need to think about, again, the private sector isn't just social media companies. There's a whole range of other actors there, but also some of the levers that we might need might not be in the internet governance space. They might be in the export control space. They might be in the sanction space. And so I think having a very broad mind of who we're bringing in, and then having a very broad mind of potential solutions is incredibly important to sort of drive that holistic approach.
Great. We're gonna, I think, say goodbye to Maura for a little bit early because she has to go. But so thank you for joining. And then, Rose, over to you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Maura.
Rose, over to you from the civil society side.
I mean, I think there's a few different pieces to this. I think sometimes it's hard for governments and industry to have conversations together, and particularly hard for governments to ask things of industry because of that line that we've discussed, right? What is the difference between the appropriateness of the United States government telling Twitter it wants something and the Russian government demanding of Twitter that it wants something? And so governments, quite in a good space, tread carefully in overexerting what they might ask. And that means that civil society then plays a particularly important convening role for a multi-stakeholder system. And like I'm searching to find a word better than multi-stakeholder because it's the wonkiest thing we could possibly say. But what we really mean by that is genuinely a process in which government, civil society, and industry are equal co-partners in driving forward and owning something. And that's just so important in tech because the kind of global human rights-based tech infrastructure that we've been discussing today is multi-stakeholder by definition and by design. And so where civil society plays that essential role, one of the tricky things is often, particularly the civil society that Nick was just referring to, civil society that represents communities in other parts of the world that are perhaps less resourced, less connected, they really struggle to keep up with this unending kind of word soup of entities, organizations, and gatherings. And so I think for the next year, for civil society to own its place in this conversation and be really deliberate and intentional about where it's going to spend its time, and demanding that it can own some of that agenda setting. And it's hard because if the United States government decides it's going to do something, it's going to happen. It's big, it's powerful, it has attention. It literally sets agenda by determining whether it participates in something or not. And the same can be said of any number of other countries around the world. And so the kind of delicate balance over the next year is going to be ensuring that civil society isn't taken in circles for 20 different countries' priorities, not quite clear which ones will win the day, and then not be able to drive its own agenda based on that really important information and insight that it has, again, from being representative of the very communities that are necessary for functioning democracies. The good news in that is, I think, as we've discussed, there's a lot of space because these are hard problems and people are really genuinely trying to figure out where to start and where process can actually happen, because no one wants to spend a bunch of time and energy on a thing that's not going to move. And so I'm hoping that civil society will take the opening, and then whether that's in the existing spaces that we have or convening additional and new conversations, invite industry to the table for some of these discussions, invite government to the table for some of these discussions, and figure out how to play an important leadership role in driving things forward, where we do ostensibly have governments saying that they're ready for that. And obviously we have industry partners like Nick literally calling for it. And so I think, the year of action needs to be a year of civil society leadership, together with every single one of these other partners, just noting the kind of power imbalance and resource imbalance of civil society itself, needing to be able to own what it can and can't do to make progress on things. So I'm hoping that we can do that. And the good news is again, unsatisfying as it might be to focus on process, democracy itself is a mechanism and a process. It's not an end state. And so if we design the conversations we're having right now and the processes that we're trying to work through to be in and of themselves democratic and representative and transparent and flexible and adaptive, then we're going to be in a much better place for this conversation in a year than we would be even just by not having these discussions or trying to do these things.
So rightly said. I mean, this is spot on, and we're just about hitting on time. I think what I will end with, so thank you both for joining, and of course, Tamora as well. This is a both global and local problem. It's something that we have to continually strive for and work on here at home in the United States, with so many issues to focus on, of all the things we talked about, from disinformation to giving broadband and access to the internet, to a digital authoritarianism, so many issues in between, to reaching the most vulnerable populations. And Rose, as you have pointed out, this is something also what the president has said. This is a work in progress, right? This is not something that is just kind of, okay, the summit happens, we'll see where we are in these commitments, and then come together again in a year and see. So I think my hope as kind of, I guess, a stakeholder in this broader community of wonderful people and organizations is that we will, on various issues, we will sort of pick the things that we can actually act on and implement and scale where we can scale to move the needle. It's investment in funds, but it also, Nick, as you have pointed out, making sure that the right stakeholders are at the table and know how to engage with each other and collaborate. So anyways, thank you all so much for joining. And then for those who are watching and who would like to watch this afterwards, we will also have this available shortly on YouTube. Thank you all. Take care.
Sarah.